I was roughly 8 or 9 at the time of this incident. I remember the attachable LCD screen for the PS1 had just come out, which would put this around 2001. My mother, older brother, and I took a trip one afternoon to our local Toys R Us. My brother and I, we typically skip the rest of the store and head straight for the video game section. I guess my mom thought the store was safe enough to leave us in that area while she looked around. The section was well lit and had its own checkout counter and attendants. It would have been very stupid for a potential creeper to attempt to grab a kid under those circumstances, but some of those sickos tend to premeditate about all of this. So my brother and I split up to go check out the newest games, and after a few minutes, I noticed that someone was talking to my brother, someone who was definitely not an employee. He was a tall Caucasian guy with a slim build, buzz-cut gray hair, and seemed to be in his 40s or 50s. They talked for a bit, and then the guy went about his business. I went up to my brother and asked him what the man wanted. My brother was more quiet than usual, and simply stated that the man had offered to buy him anything he wanted from the store if he did the man a favor in return. When I asked what that was, my brother did not respond. As a kid, I guess I couldn't fathom the man's true intentions, and merely thought he genuinely was going to buy a gift and leave us alone forever. The only thing running through my head was to grab the most expensive game console and find the guy again. I was very naive. Anyway, my brother knew better. He grabbed my arm and told me to forget about it. As we were walking towards the car a little while later, I looked at the adjacent street and spotted the man. I pointed towards him and told my mom about what happened. He was staring right back at us as he drove away in his Jeep, possibly still reeling from almost getting caught. Looking back, I'm glad the man hadn't approached me instead. Back about 15 years ago when I was in grade school, my mom brought my best friend and I to a Toys R Us as a treat for turning in an impressive report card. I remember at the time Star Wars Attack of the Clones was out in theaters, and I was all into Star Wars at the time. My friend and I were digging through the aisle where all the toy lightsabers were displayed. I was excited to try to find Mace Windu's purple blade, as I already had a green one at home. We were both talking a mile a minute like excited kids tend to do, when the generic background noise in the store was suddenly cut off, and a dry, chilling voice came on. My friend and I immediately stopped talking and gave each other weird looks. The voice wasn't right. It was high-pitched yet deep, furious yet calm. I honestly don't remember what it was saying. It was using long words I didn't understand. But what struck me was that it felt like a prayer being chanted, or a spell being cast. Looking back, I'm pretty sure it was a recording being fed through a voice changer. But of course at the time, I couldn't wrap my head around that. Suddenly the voice was abruptly cut off, and was replaced by the sound of screaming. It was clearly a woman, and in the background, there was the sound of a chainsaw being revved up. I remember being overwhelmed with that sickening feeling of paralyzing fear that roots you to the spot, and then causes you to break down and cry. I'm not sure how many of you remember that kind of fear from your childhood, but that's the kind of fear I felt when the screaming began. I found myself unable to move, even to cover my ears with my hands. All I could do was stare wide-eyed at my friend, as the sound of flesh being cut into and blood splurting filled the store. That's when I started to cry. Not a bawling, sobbing cry, but a confused, trying to be brave type of crying. I had no idea what I was listening to, or what to do about it. My friend also started crying. My mom had been in the neighboring aisle, and that was about the point she grabbed us both and started pulling us frantically out of the store. That's when we noticed a stampede of people making for the exits. There were plenty of other children that were in tears, and adults yelling angrily. The loudspeaker cut off right before I reached the door, and suddenly the woman's screaming was gone. but it continued to echo through my head. Once we got outside, I just remembered curling into a ball in the back seat of my mom's car and letting the tears flow from my face down to the seat cushion. I honestly don't recall much after that. I was in a daze, asking myself over and over again if a woman had just been cut in half in the store. Everything outside the car was a blur. I remember the cops showing up and my mom speaking to them. Eventually my mom got in the car and told us that it had only been a fake recording and that no one had actually died, and a very bad man inside had played it over the loudspeaker as a joke. But even if it was just a recording, the screaming did not sound fake. Even to this day, I still pray that it was. Toys R Us was in full damage control after that. My mom said she was literally given hundreds of dollars worth of gift cards and exclusive deals on items that had not yet been released. My mom treated me and my friend to the biggest ice cream sundae ever not too long after, but that still didn't silence the screaming in my head. In fact, for several weeks after that, I couldn't sleep. For the next couple of years, my friend and I were able to get pretty much any toy or video game we wanted because they were essentially free of charge, though still that location had closed down not long afterwards. And it was replaced with a Best Buy. At the time, I wasn't active on the internet or anything, so I don't know how widespread the news was. I imagine today it would be reported all across America if a satanic ritual was played as a hoax over the loudspeaker in a kid's toy store. Of course, most kids are much tougher nowadays because they're exposed to much more violent video games and internet content than I had available back then. I've since tried to go back and research it, but I can't find anything. My mom remembers it well and always gives me a sympathetic pat on the back when it's recalled. So yeah, that's my story. I'm not sure what happened to the guy that was arrested, but I hope it was harsh. Nowadays, I buy toys at Fi. My twin sister and I rent a small house at the end of a cul-de-sac. Beyond the tree line in our backyard is a chain link fence, and behind that fence is a closed down Toys R Us store. Now, I don't recommend that anyone else try this, as it's technically trespassing. But this was a unique situation, and we couldn't resist taking advantage of it. When big franchise stores go out of business, they liquidate all their stock. Most of it gets heavily discounted for the sake of clearing the shelves, while some of the nicer stuff gets packed up and shipped off to warehouses, where I'm sure they'll be sold online. But quite a bit of it is just junked. My sister and I would just watch as employees would exit out the back and dump load after load of merchandise into the dumpsters. Keep in mind that none of it is great quality stuff. In fact, it's mostly cheap stuff. But the way I see it, once it's in the dumpster, it's trash and it's free. After business hours, my sister and I would wheel our rolling suitcase back through the trees, sneak through the opening in the fence, and go dumpster diving. We found a few neat things, mostly posters and displays for video games, some cheap action figures and dolls, and a few board games in damaged boxes. We would collect it all, put it all into our suitcase, and then head back home. Now, given that we were in our 20s, we knew that we shouldn't be doing this, but we couldn't resist saving all this cool stuff that was just going to rot away in a landfill somewhere. Most of it we kept, and some of it we gave away to friends, but we didn't resell any of it online or anything. After we had gone dumpster diving about 7 or 8 times, I was getting tired of it. There's always actual trash in the dumpsters as well that we'd have to sort through, including old food. Ugh. I once had a fly buzz right into my mouth. Needless to say, I was ready to call it quits on the whole thing, but my sister pressured me into doing it one last time. Normally we would go at dusk, stay for about 20 minutes or so, and then leave. We didn't like going after nightfall because then we would need flashlights, and that would draw too much attention to ourselves. The final time we went was already after dark, mostly because I had procrastinated as I didn't really want to go. When my sister and I slipped through the opening in the fence, I handed her one of those tiny keychain flashlights and told her to keep it handy while she looked around. She hopped into the dumpster and started digging through the junk, which I recall was just mostly shells and a few of those plastic display posters. I was casually pacing back and forth, watching the area around us and taking the stuff she handed to me and tossing them into a bag. For the record, neither of us had been drinking. We weren't carrying any weapons, and we weren't acting obnoxious and drawing attention to ourselves. We were barely talking. Yeah, we were trespassing, but that alone isn't enough of a crime for what was about to come. After about 10 minutes, I told my sister it was time to go. She was making too much noise shifting around those shells, and I was worried about getting caught. I was zipping up the bag when I heard the chain link fence rattle back around where the opening was. Now in retrospect, this may have had nothing to do with what was about to happen, but a part of me thinks it's connected. I didn't have a flashlight, so I couldn't glance over into the area to investigate. But I had entered through that fence often enough to know what it sounded like when someone passed through it, and this sounded like that exactly. I started tapping the side of the dumpster, telling my sister to hurry up. She pulled out a cracked Iron Man mask and handed it to me, then began to crawl out of the dumpster. Right as her feet touched the pavement, the lid of the dumpster swung down hard and slammed itself right on her fingers. The sound of the lid falling that hard was like a bomb going off. I jumped about a foot in the air. My sister cried out in pain and cursed. The next thing we knew, there was what sounded like a war cry coming from behind the dumpster. A man steps out from behind it and swings one of those retractable nightsticks right at my head. It was pure luck that I chose that moment to step backwards and haphazardly dodge the swing. It made a loud clanging sound against the metal dumpster as the guy screamed like a madman and swung again. I yelled for my sister to run. We abandoned the suitcase. We both sprinted towards the front of the building. The guy started sprinting after us, screaming in a language that was neither English nor Spanish. At first he was right on our heels, but my sister and I were both in pretty good shape. So after a little while running, we left the guy in the dust. Fortunately, we were both in our sneakers that night. The man then hurled his baton at us, and it clattered across the pavement to my right, but we kept running. Once around the front of the building, we then sprinted to the road and the crosswalk. The guy turned the corner and slammed right into one of those freestanding cement poles that are normally located by the entrance to prevent cars from crashing into the doors. I glanced over my shoulder and saw him hit the ground, but the man got right back up like he barely felt it and kept running. When we made it to the intersection, I shoved my sister in the direction of our house and told her to keep running. This is the part that blows my mind. Not only was the man still chasing us, but he was still screaming at the top of his lungs and wielding a stun gun in each hand, both of which were buzzing loudly as he ran. And I neglected to mention that this man was not wearing a security guard uniform. He was just completely out of his mind. I yelled at someone who was idle at a stoplight to call the cops, and then I took off in the opposite direction my sister went. Fortunately, after I crossed the road and ran down a few back alleys, I ended up losing him, but I could still hear him screaming. I doubled back as I watched him run in between parked cars up and down the street, clearly furious that he'd lost me. Then, I kid you not, one of his sleeves caught fire. My guess is that one of the stun guns made contact and ignited it. I cut back around a gas station and made for home as I heard the sirens approaching in the distance. When I got home, I found my sister safe, although one of her fingers were broken, and she ended up losing 2 of her fingernails from the dumpster lid. I know this story is kind of comical looking back, but as it was happening, it was terrifying and incredibly surreal. This guy was dressed in a hoodie and jeans and reeked of sweat. He clearly was not a security guard or anything. He didn't announce himself before approaching us. He just immediately started attacking us, and I have a horrifying gut feeling that he would have killed us had we not chosen to run immediately. My best guess is that he was some homeless guy with some serious mental health issues. I don't know whatever happened to him, but needless to say, my dumpster diving days are very much over. So the other night, my friends and I were walking to the movies at around 9 p.m. As we were heading to the plaza where the theater was located, I decided to stop and have a smoke in front of the empty storefront that used to be Toys R Us. My friends all paused to wait for me and pulled out their phones while I lazily peered through the window into the darkened store. I noticed the front doors were locked with chains and a padlock on the outside, and I considered how weird it was securing it from the outside, where someone could easily break the lock and go inside. As I looked past my reflection and let my eyes wander down the rows of empty shelves, I noticed a glimmer of light from down one of the aisles. I moved a few steps over and tried to get a better look at what it was, and when I noticed it again, I realized it wasn't a source. It was a reflection. 2 points of reflected lights were staring back at me like eyes from deep in the back of the store. I said aloud, "What? No way," as I put my hands up to the sides of my face to get a better look while my friends were asking, "What's happening?" The eyes shifted, then vanished, only for a second before reappearing in a new spot a few feet away. I knocked on the window and called out to my friends, "Hey, there's someone in there trying to freak me out." As soon as I said that, something large struck the window from the inside, and I leapt back. A metal bracket the size of a frying pan had just been thrown against the window from somewhere deep inside the store. My friends all heard it and immediately rushed over, but I continued to retreat backwards. In that split second after the bracket struck the window, I thought I saw the eyes shift again, and I saw a shadowy figure crawl across another aisle. Not walk, crawl on all fours. Whatever I was witnessing was either a severely deranged human or some kind of unknown creature. My friends started recording the inside of the store on their phones, but none of them were able to capture anything except their own reflections in the darkness just beyond the window. I just dropped my cigarette and immediately started walking away. Even if it was just some prank, I was done. We saw the movie and walked home using a different route without passing the store. And to be honest, I forgot all about the encounter until recently. I guess when something strange like that happens, something that we cannot explain, our subconscious just swallows it, choosing to overlook it because it just doesn't make any sense. It can't be categorized, so it just doesn't reflect on it. I did some research, and the building is set to be demolished next month. I can't help but wonder, were those chains meant to keep people out, or to keep something inside? I'm part of an exclusive girls-only paintball club. Normally we meet about 8 or 10 times during the summer months to battle in designated paintball areas, but on occasion during the off months we choose an isolated private location to meet instead. When the economy crashed back in '08, my neighboring town went to shit, and most of its residents took off. There was an abandoned shopping plaza that was hidden behind a small section of woods that used to house a Toys R Us, a Kmart, and a Goodwill before the whole thing was shut down. It's been deserted so long that 6 inches of grass is growing up in between the cracks in the parking lots. Of course, there were chains and fences blocking off the property, but after scoping it out, my girlfriends and I concluded that it wasn't being monitored and security wasn't making regular visits, so we decided to turn it into our battlefield. We broke open a few doors so that we could run through the abandoned stores to make it more fun. Plenty of furniture and shelving had been left abandoned, and we dragged some of them out to the parking lot to use them as obstacles for cover. We spent most of our Saturday afternoon there paintballing and recoloring the place with blotches of red and blue everywhere. We were enjoying ourselves until we heard over the radio the emergency notice to stand down as someone had been injured. We all gathered in what used to be the Toys R Us stockroom. We discovered that our friend had fallen into a shaft that had been hidden underneath a tarp lying on the floor. It was about an 8-foot drop and was only accessible by a ladder that led down into a basement area. Our friend was bruised and shaken, but she would be fine. A few of us helped her climb out, but myself and 3 others took flashlights down into the section of basement, and then we soon discovered something very unnerving. There was a row of shackles bolted into the wall. There were even scratch marks on the floor and wall with what looked to be dried blood. It resembled some kind of torture chamber. A feeling of dread overwhelmed me. I can't explain it. But have you ever been to a place where you could just tell something terrible had happened there? The iron chains did not appear to be that old. One of my friends walked over to one of the scratch marks on the wall. She then turned to the rest of us. "This is fresh." We gathered up our crew and left, making sure to take everything with us that may have left clues as to who exactly we were. We anonymously reported our findings to the police and never returned to that property again. This memory is a bit hazy, mostly because I was only 4 years old, but the thought of it still sticks with me. My mom was taking me to Toys R Us. It was a reward for me learning how to count to 10, and my mom may have been a tad bit too excited about it. As we pulled up in the parking lot, I got so anxious I almost crossed the street without holding my mom's hand. When we walked through the sliding doors, I was amazed. I wanted to look at all the toys, however, my mom walked towards the backpack section. I didn't want to wait any longer, so I bolted off to the area with the toys, and I began to scour through everything I wanted. That wasn't the best decision, as I was soon lost shortly after. I brushed it off, and I continued to look at all the toys a bit more. Successfully distracting myself, I was a bit more comfortable. But that was short-lived, as suddenly a very tall, lanky man who appeared to be in his mid-30s approached me. He had a shaved face, glasses, and pretty long hair for a guy. He smiled at me and asked, "Hey, are you lost, little guy?" I felt awkward for a second, and then replied honestly, "Yeah, I can't find my mommy." He smiled even more and said that he'd help me find my mother. But first he said he needed to use the bathroom. He grabbed my hand and began to drag me along. Soon he was tugging and pulling me faster and harder, which really hurt my hand. As we were approaching the bathroom, I heard my mom from a far distance screaming for me. "David!" Even then, the man did not let up. He brought me into the stall and told me to undo my pants. "My mom says I shouldn't talk to strangers," I said, even though it was a little late for that. He reached out towards me, but shortly after, we heard a man barge in through the bathroom door. I can't remember if he unlocked the stall or just busted the lock, but he got in fast enough and dragged the man in front of me out. But before that happened, I remember the man looking down at me and saying, "Our playtime's not over yet." I was brought back to my mom, who was crying. I was so confused about the entire situation. All of it happened so suddenly. I was taken to counseling for a while to help me forget about this point in my life. As I've grown up and reflected on that memory, I've realized that those 30 seconds or so have screwed up so many aspects of my social life as a child. Still to this day, I have an irrational distrust of adult men, and I stay withdrawn from other people. Keep your kids close at all times in public. Trusting your children isn't the problem. It's trusting strangers. The Toys R Us near my house shut down about a week ago. So on the final day of its going out of business sale, me and my friend Oliver decided to go see all the cheap stuff that nobody else wanted. When we arrived, everything was as I expected. The employees that were left were walking around nonchalantly. The store was almost completely barren, and the few customers that were left were buying whatever they could from the shelves, some excited and others desperate. I got about $7 worth of candy while my friend went to use the bathroom. I headed over to the cashier, she rung me up, and then I waited for Oliver. Around 4 minutes later, he came out towards the exit, and we started to walk to my house. But when we passed a nearby car wash, Oliver said he had forgotten his phone, and by some bizarre coincidence, I also forgot my wallet. So I gave him the bag of candy and my house keys, and said I'd get our stuff and meet him at the house. I walked back into the Toys R Us, and I went to the front register. The obviously high teenager at the front desk gave me my wallet, but no phone. So I walked to the bathroom to retrieve the phone. When I opened the creaky door, everything immediately felt off. I wasn't scared, more unsettled. I saw my friend's phone right by the sink and I grabbed it, but as soon as I went to leave, the door just wouldn't open. Right away, I shouted for the employees or anyone that could hear me, but I met with no response and the door never opened. As I was struggling to pull the door, the stall doors behind me shot right open, and then they closed just as spontaneously. This spooked me so bad, I almost shot right out of my skin as I experienced a deep sudden chill, and then the lights went dark. I started crying, but my mood switched abruptly to sheer panic when I felt a hand grab my ankle. As soon as I inhaled deeply to scream, the door opened. Oliver was right in front of me. I was crying. Behind me, everything was back to normal. The lights were on, the stalls were closed, and there was no one else in the bathroom with me. I bolted past Oliver, and I didn't stop running until I couldn't see the store behind me. Oliver eventually caught up with me, and I told him everything. I haven't told anyone else in person because I know how unrealistic it sounds, but to this day, it still haunts me. A couple years ago, I worked at a local Toys R Us for a few months. It was a location in Oklahoma, and it was the worst job I've ever had. While my coworkers were nice, I despised the customers. I've never been good with people, and I've worked jobs before in customer service. But there was something about the people who regularly came to our Toys R Us. Literally, most of them were irritable, angry, fed up, and sometimes even creepy. I tried my best to work my register with a smile, but it didn't take long for that to be drained right out of me. For example, one time there was a lady who wasn't happy with the speed I was ringing up her items. I was new at the time, and I was trying to be as fast and efficient as possible. Even still, she ended up reaching over the counter and just barely missed as she tried to slap me. Then on a different occasion, there was this guy who followed me to my car and sat down on the pavement right behind it. I had to get some of my coworkers to drag this psycho away from my vehicle so I could actually go home. I never seen the guy before. I still don't know why he did that. What really takes the cake was the homeless looking person who stayed after hours. We were closing down the store one night, but I recall seeing a strange looking and awfully tall man walk in maybe 7 minutes before we closed. As we started locking up, I mentioned to my manager that the tall, ragged-looking man never left, so he asked if we could all start checking the aisles. I walked into the girls' toy section, slowly checking up and down each aisle and calling out to anyone who might still be there that we were closing. After checking each aisle twice, I moved on to the furthest aisles from the front of the store, the newborn and baby section, the place where they keep strollers, diapers, etc. I made my way from the middle to the back corner, from diapers and toys to strollers. I hadn't seen anyone, no trace of a person anywhere, not until I got to the very corner, and there he was. He was about 6'6", dressed in a ragged, lengthy overcoat, which nearly touched the ground. He was facing away from me, seemingly staring straight down onto the bottom shelves of boxed strollers. Sir? I called out, albeit a bit nervously. We're closing now. If you could please bring your items to the front so we could get you on your way. He didn't budge even an inch. Instead, he just kept looking down at that angle. I took a step towards him. Sir? And then he started shaking. No, convulsing as he stood there. It wasn't like he was having a seizure or something. Oddly enough, it was more like he was vibrating. I'm not sure if that even makes sense. Even so, it was deeply unsettling. When he turned towards me, I finally saw his face. From his eyes, mouth, and nose, there were thick streams of blood flowing like water from a faucet from them. I screamed, turned, and ran, and only a few moments, my coworkers found me in tears, shaking. I pointed to where the man was, and they ran over to that same corner of the building, but they came back in only a few seconds. "Laney, there's no one over there," my manager explained. I said, "No, there has to be." Yet there was no trace of the man. None of us, not even me, had seen him exit the building. I kept thinking he had to be in here somewhere. I ended up getting the okay to leave right after that, getting to skip out on my closing duties because honestly, I was a bit traumatized. I tried to keep that frightening scene from my mind, but it was impossible. I got no sleep that night, and because of that, I thought about calling in sick the next day. Oddly enough, work called me, asking me to come in to take a look at something. When I arrived, they brought me to the back of the building in a room with about 12 little CCTVs with feeds from the security cameras. "Laney, if you can, would you look at this footage for us?" my manager asked. I nodded and sat down. Another employee in the room with us clicked a button on a remote, and one of the small screens began to play. I saw me at the bottom of the screen. The camera was facing directly at the corner of the stroller section, exactly where the man had been standing. I then saw myself scream, yet the corner remained empty. The man never even appeared in the tape, not a single frame of his existence. I don't know what I saw that night or who I saw. Maybe I have some sort of mental problem or delusion. But I know I saw something in that store, and I'll never forget my few months working there. I'll be frank with you, I'm very glad Toys R Us is closing down. I'm 31 and from Cleveland, Ohio. This story is an old one, but it still sticks out in my mind all these years later, especially when I go shopping. I break out in a nervous sweat because of what I saw and had experienced so many years ago. No one I've told about this has ever believed me, not friends, family, or coworkers. They all give me this sideways glance, and some of them even mutter that I'm crazy behind my back, but I know I'm not. I know what I went through, and I will never forget it. The story takes place in 2003 in my hometown. The Iraq War had just kicked off, and my dad, who was in the Air Force, was stationed in Qatar. That left just me, my mom, and my Aunt Tracy. She was a bit of a wild child, and at age 18 had gotten herself pregnant. She kept the kid, and my dad took pity on her and let her live with us. At the time, her son Matthew was turning 5. I actually liked Matthew a lot more than Tracy, and I wanted to get him something nice for his birthday. I ended up going to Toys R Us to see what your typical hyperactive 5-year-old might enjoy. It was around dusk on a September evening, and I was hoping I wouldn't lose track of time wandering the store as night was fast approaching, and I'd much rather not have to drive home in the dark by myself. The weather was much warmer than normal, so I was glad to be inside the air-conditioned store. There were kids running around dragging their aggrieved parents from aisle to aisle. I had to smile. I was the same way as a child. I always loved my dolls, and constantly wanted a new one. Anyway, I wandered the aisles trying to think of something we could have fun doing together, since Tracy was often off with her girlfriends, and paid less attention to Matthew than he deserved. Then it came to me. The Lego aisle. Everybody loves Legos, and I did too as a kid, and a little bit now to be honest. I hustled off to the Lego aisle, which happened to be at the very back of the store, but as I approached the second to the last aisle, I paused. A weird feeling came over me. A totally random sense of dread gradually was building in my stomach. I glanced around. If this odd vibe was affecting anyone else, they weren't showing it. They were all just going about their business normally, kids running around, parents trying to control them. Everyone else acting normal. It helped relax me for a moment, so I took a deep breath and walked toward the Lego aisle. The store was packed. You couldn't go down any of the aisles without seeing at least 3 families perusing the merchandise with a couple of employees trying to help them. But when I turned the corner, I froze. There seemed to materialize an overwhelming silence that just came upon me suddenly out of nowhere. There were no more children yelling or people talking, which you would expect in an overly crowded store. Even the background beeping of the checkout scanner had gone silent, and this section I walked into was oddly desolate. I had seen not so much as one other person perusing this area, and as I took in the unusual silence, becoming more aware of the circumstance, I realized how eerily unsettling it really was. A petrifying chill ran through me, and a vibe of dread saturated the environment. Something told me to leave immediately, but I powered through it, thinking my mind was being irrational. I also must mention that it was suddenly cold, so much colder than when I had first walked in, as if the air conditioning was on full blast. I walked into the Lego aisle, and there I saw him, a little kid in a dark gray hoodie with his hood pulled up. He was standing alone in the middle of the aisle sideways to me, looking intently at the Lego set stacked neatly along the shelves. I grew concerned as I noticed him. My good Samaritan instincts kicked in. Here was a child, alone and unattended in this deserted, empty area, maybe even lost, but I remember the situation just seemed off. I don't know how to explain it. Anyway, I tried to push the strange thoughts out of my head, and I put on my best smile as I approached him. I stooped down to his eye level and asked, "Hey, are you The words got stuck in my throat, because when this child turned around and looked at me, it felt like my soul died inside me. His eyes were piercing black, deep, soulless, and I mean pitch black. His skin was deathly pale, and when his piercing pitch black eyes met with mine, he smiled, but his smile was frighteningly wide, extending to the edges of his cheekbones, a mouth wider than I thought humanly possible, and his parted lips revealed a mouthful of bloody, sharp-pointed needle-like teeth. My mouth flapped uselessly, dimly. I felt the warm trickle of urine running down my leg, and my heart nearly burst when he, or it, spoke to me.
"Hello, Jessica,"
it said in a voice nightmarishly deep and harsh. I was frozen in terror. I wanted to scream, but nothing came out. I wanted to run, but I couldn't move. I was petrified, and in addition to my terror, I was perplexed when I realized this thing knew my name. It spoke again.
"Won't you like to play with me?"
It sounded demanding and threatening, and not like a request, as it reached out with one hand, a hand that looked disturbingly normal and childlike, palm up as if inviting me to take it. Then he slowly started walking towards me. That was what broke me out of my trance. I turned around and blasted out of that aisle and away from the area. I remember skidding as I made my turn to end up crashing through a display. I realized I was once again surrounded by crowds of people staring, children yelling, and the regular noise of a crowded store. The sense of normalcy brought a great relief I can't describe, including the returned background beeping of the checkout scanner. Though still, I wanted out of that store at once as I got back up to run, not caring about the mess I created. An employee was yelling at me, but I didn't care. I wasn't going to stop running until that thing was a distant memory in my rearview mirror. I charged through the doors, out of that store, outside in the warm lit parking lot, as the last bit of sunlight was fading into the evening. I dove into my car, slammed the keys into the ignition, and started it. I burnt rubber pulling out, and I glanced up to see a store manager gesturing to get my attention and shouting. But behind him, leaning out from behind his legs, was that child, waving and still grinning with that impossibly wide, frightening, blood-stained smile, staring at me with those cold, lifeless, pitch-black eyes. I sped out of there, and I never looked back. It's been years, and I'm still not sure what it was. I no doubt have heard of the black-eyed kids, but I'm not entirely sure that's what it was. They seem to show up mostly at night, and look much more normal than what I saw. Maybe he was a demon, but why was I the only one that seemed to notice it? I'm still unsure. Maybe I really am going crazy. But in case I'm not, crazy Toys R Us demon, let's never meet again.